For 5 years, Rafael Corvino had lived in a world without color. The explosion at the industrial laundry on the Chelsea waterfront that year hadn't only taken the only sister of the man all of Boston stepped carefully around it, had taken the light from his eyes forever. 4 of the finest specialists in New England had signed the same conclusion. The optic nerve was dead, and nothing further could be done. Then, on an August afternoon, as the last of the daylight swept across the drawing room of the estate, Naomi Fletcher, a housemaid who had been there less than 2 months, stopped dead while wiping a table 3 steps away. Something had just caught the light inside the left eye of the man seated in the leather armchair. A point of brightness no larger than a pinhead, and it had an edge to it. She set the cloth down. She drew the small penlight from her apron pocket, the old tool her mother had left behind. And then she did the one thing no servant in that house had dared to do in 5 years. She knelt down in front of the most powerful man in Boston and shone a light straight into the eyes that had been declared blind. Both pupils contracted. Rafael Corvino caught her wrist before she could pull her hand away. And in that moment, neither of them yet knew that whatever lay behind that clouded cornea could prove that for 5 years, the man this entire city bowed to had been deceived by the very people closest to him. But to understand what happened that afternoon, we have to go back 6 weeks. To the morning Naomi Fletcher first walked through the iron gates of the Corvino estate. If this opening has already pulled you in, leave a like so we know you're here. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this one are told here every single week. And if you know someone who would want to sit through all of it beside you, please share it with them. The last bus dropped Naomi Fletcher at the Coastal Road intersection at 7:15 in the morning, and the driver told her that the route didn't continue into the estate district, so she would have to walk the rest of the way. She thanked him, pulled her 2 suitcases down the bus steps, then stood on the roadside for a moment, looking at the paved slope stretching ahead, a little more than half a mile. The suitcase wheels rattled across the road damp with morning mist, and approximately every 200 steps, she had to switch hands because her fingers had gone numb. Inside her wallet, folded into quarters and tucked behind her identification card, was the paper bearing the figure of $61,000, the loan her former husband had taken out in her name before disappearing from the state. In the outer pocket of the smaller suitcase, she kept a penlight, an old tool that had belonged to her mother, the only thing she had kept after selling everything in the Lowell apartment. She had brought it because she didn't know where else to put it. The employment agency in Somerville had given her this address 2 days earlier, along with a salary higher than any other position she had applied for, and before handing her the envelope, the woman behind the counter had said only one thing, that the people in this house didn't like questions. So she shouldn't ask too many either. Naomi had nodded. After 9 months of submitting applications without receiving a single call, after leaving her former hospital over missing medication she hadn't taken, and without a letter of recommendation to carry with her, she was no longer in a position to choose. The iron gates appeared beyond the final curve, nearly twice her height, both sides closed and no bell in sight. Naomi set down her suitcases, and before she could find where she was supposed to press, the gate on the right began to move. Someone had seen her long before she arrived. The man who stepped out was approximately 50 years old, with closely cropped hair and the gait of someone who had spent more of his life standing guard than sitting down. He didn't offer his hand. He stopped 2 steps away and looked her over once from head to toe, slowly, as though inspecting a package that had just been delivered. "You're Fletcher." "Yes, sir. Bruno Tesoro." He didn't explain what he did there. "Do you live with anyone?" "No, sir. It's just me." "Does anyone know you've come to work here?" Naomi considered that question longer than she intended. She thought of her mother, who had been in the ground for 26 months. She thought of the man who had signed his name to the loan papers and left. She thought of the contact list in the inexpensive phone tucked inside her coat pocket, where only 4 numbers remained, 3 of them belonging to debt collection agencies. "No one, sir." Bruno nodded once. That answer seemed to satisfy him more than the first 2 combined. "Last question. Do you intend to stay long?" Naomi looked up at him. She could have given the answer people usually offered during interviews, that she hoped to remain for many years, that she considered this an opportunity. But she hadn't lied to anyone in 4 months, mainly because there was no one left to lie to. "I'll stay as long as I'm allowed to." Bruno studied her for another 2 seconds. Then he bent down, lifted the larger suitcase with one hand, as though it were empty, and turned his back as he walked through the gates. "There are a few rules here," he said without looking back. "Mrs. Pomeroy will explain them. Listen carefully. In this house, no one repeats themselves a second time." Naomi pulled the remaining suitcase and stepped through the iron gates. Behind her, both sides closed with a crisp metallic click, and she didn't turn to look. Mrs. Ada Pomeroy was waiting at the rear kitchen door with flowers still clinging to her hands, and she looked at Naomi with the eyes of someone who had escorted more young women out through that door than she had welcomed in. She showed Naomi the room at the end of the servants' wing, which contained a single bed, a chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the lawn. Naomi set both suitcases at the foot of the bed, and before she could open them, Mrs. Pomeroy sat on the edge of the chair and told her to remain standing until she had heard everything. "There are 3 rules here," she said. "If you can remember all 3, you can stay. If you can't, then that's the end of it. I'm telling you now so neither of us wastes our time." Naomi straightened. "First, don't speak loudly. Don't call to each other across the corridors. Don't slam doors, and don't drop anything on the stone floor. People hear very clearly in this house." "Yes, ma'am." "Second, don't move anything. Whatever chair stands in a particular place must remain there. If you clean a table, lift the vase and put it back in exactly the same place, inside the same ring of dust. Move a chair even slightly from its position, and I promise you that someone will know before the day is over. Everything in this house has its place, and those places haven't changed in 5 years." Naomi nodded. She was beginning to understand why the wages were higher here than anywhere else. "Third, Mrs. Pomeroy brushed her hands against her apron and delivered this rule in exactly the same tone she had used when speaking about the vase. Neither heavier nor lighter. Never look directly at the master of the house. When you bring him something, lower your face, set it down, and step back. If you pass him in a corridor, move to one side and look at the floor. Don't look at his face. Don't look into his eyes." Naomi waited for her to explain why. She didn't. Mrs. Pomeroy rose, checked whether the window was sticking, then told Naomi to report to the kitchen at 6 o'clock the following morning. That night, Naomi lay listening to the wind moving across the lawn and thought about the 3rd rule. She had worked in a hospital for 3 years and pushed medication carts through corridors where people told her not to look inside certain rooms. But no place had ever told her not to look into a person's eyes. At 10 minutes to 6 the following morning, she was already standing in the kitchen. Mrs. Pomeroy assigned her to clean the row of banisters along the main staircase and instructed her to finish before 6:20, not 1 minute later. Naomi finished at 6:18. She was rolling up the cloth when Mrs. Pomeroy gestured from the far end of the corridor, and both women stepped into the recess beside the wooden cabinet against the wall. The door at the opposite end of the 2nd floor opened. The man who emerged wasn't carrying a cane. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a white shirt and dark sunglasses even though the lights inside the house hadn't been switched on, and dawn had not yet fully broken outside. He didn't reach out for the wall. He didn't test the floor with his feet. He simply walked, steadily, each stride exactly the same length as the one before, moving directly along the corridor like a man who knew precisely where he stood on the map inside his mind. When he reached the console table in the middle of the corridor, he shifted approximately 1 hand's breadth to the left at the exact moment he needed to, then returned to his original path. Naomi was less than 10 feet away when he passed. She lowered her face exactly as she had been instructed, but she could still see his lips moving. He wasn't saying anything. He was counting. His hand came to rest on the top of the banister at the exact moment he reached it, neither early nor late, and then he began descending the stairs. Only when the sound of his footsteps had faded on the floor below did Mrs. Pomeroy step out of the recess. 84, she murmured, almost to herself, from his bedroom door to the foot of the stairs. He's been counting them for 5 years. He won't let anyone support him or guide him. She took the cloth from Naomi's hand and started toward the kitchen. "There are 16 people in this house," she added after walking a few steps. "And you'll see, my dear, no one tells him anything anymore." Bruno Tesoro was waiting at the foot of the staircase, exactly 2 steps from the final stair, as he had stood every morning throughout his 18 years of service in this house. When Raphael reached him, Bruno extended a hand and touched his elbow lightly twice, no more and no less. It wasn't assistance. It was a signal that someone was there. Raphael didn't startle or break his stride. He merely inclined his head slightly in Bruno's direction. Bruno began reciting the day's schedule in the exact order he always followed, an order that had never changed. Time first, task second, person first, location second, family matters before business at the docks. 7:30. Falcone's car will arrive at the main gates with the documents from cold storage warehouse number 2. They'll be waiting for your signature. 9 o'clock, Mr. Delgado will call from dock number 7 on the line in your study. 11 o'clock. Attorney Ferrante will come here with 2 sets of files. Nothing in the afternoon, nothing in the evening. Raphael nodded once. Dr. Sloane is still coming at 7 this Thursday, Bruno added. I know. Raphael walked toward the breakfast room. Bruno remained half a step behind him, maintaining that exact distance throughout the corridor, and said nothing more until the master of the house was seated. Raphael Corvino's breakfast was always arranged in the same way. The plate in the center, the glass on the right, the napkin on the left, the spoon and knife placed parallel to each other at equal distances from the edge of the plate. He didn't feel around for anything. He lightly touched the base of the glass with the back of his hand before taking hold of it, and that was the only movement during the entire meal that revealed this man couldn't see. At 9:30, after the call from dock number 7 had ended, Raphael told Bruno to leave and close the door. He sat motionless in the study for approximately 1 minute. Then he pushed his chair backward, turned toward the left side of the desk, and opened the second drawer. The drawer was almost empty. It contained only a flat tin box and an envelope. He didn't need to search. His hand went directly to the envelope, as though following a road he had traveled hundreds of times. He lifted it with both hands. The envelope was made of ordinary paper, small in size, the kind sold in packages of 10 at a general store. Its flap was still sealed. He ran his thumb slowly along the sealed edge, from left to right, and then from right to left. After 5 years, the adhesive had hardened and become brittle, and the paper had curled slightly at one corner. His finger stopped at the upper right corner, where the courier stamp had been marked on the surface of the paper. May 14th. He held his finger there longer than anywhere else. He didn't need anyone to read that date aloud. He had known it since before he lost the ability to read. Beneath the stamp, on the front of the envelope, was a handwritten line. He didn't touch those words. He had never touched those words. He held the envelope motionless in his hands for approximately 2 minutes. Then he returned it to the drawer in exactly the same position, and facing the same direction, with the stamp turned upward. He closed the drawer. Outside the door, Bruno was still standing there. He had stood that way almost every week for 5 years, and he knew precisely what was inside the second drawer on the left. He had never asked about it. On the 5th day, Mrs. Pomeroy assigned Naomi to carry the afternoon tea to the rear veranda. She gave precise instructions. At exactly 4 o'clock, place it on the small table to the right of his chair, turn the cup handle toward his hand, then step away. Don't ask whether he needs anything. Don't wait for him to say thank you. Simply step away. Naomi carried the tray onto the veranda at 1 minute to 4. Raphael was already seated there in the wicker chair facing the sea, wearing his dark sunglasses with both hands resting on the chair arms. She set down the cup, turned the handle to the right, and took 1 step backward. Then she remained there. She didn't know why she stayed. The water that day had taken on an appearance unlike anything she had seen during her 4 days in the house. And the first thought that crossed her mind, so quickly she scarcely had time to stop it, was that he didn't know. She opened her mouth and spoke in an ordinary voice, neither slower nor louder than the one she used when speaking with Mrs. Pomeroy in the kitchen. The tide is going out, sir. The water has receded quite far and exposed a long strip of dark brown mud, and there are pools left behind across it, shining like pieces of broken mirror. This morning, all of it was underwater. Raphael's right hand had been reaching toward the teacup. It stopped midway. Naomi didn't notice. She was looking out toward the sea. The water isn't blue today. It's the color of a nickel left in a drawer for too long, slightly gray, and it grows darker the farther it reaches. There are 3 boats. The nearest is anchored approximately 650 feet from shore. It's painted white, but the lower part of the hull has yellowed almost to the side. The second boat is smaller and painted red, and it's rocking much more than the other 2, probably because it's lighter. The third is almost impossible to see now. There's only a dark mark where the water meets the sky. She paused and raised her gaze. The clouds are divided into 2 layers. The lower layer is moving quickly from left to right. The upper layer is almost motionless. Sunlight is passing through a gap between them and falling across the water in a long band of light, and that band isn't staying still. It's slowly sliding toward the red boat. I think it will reach it in approximately 10 minutes. Naomi fell silent. She heard the wind and the distant water, and then she heard, within her own mind, everything she had just said. She stepped back again, gripping the edge of the tray tightly. She wasn't permitted to speak loudly. She wasn't permitted to move anything. She wasn't permitted to look directly at the master of the house. Mrs. Pomeroy had made it clear that in this place, no one repeated a warning twice. Raphael Corvino turned his head. He turned slowly, without any sudden movement, until his face was directed toward her. The dark sunglasses concealed his eyes completely, so Naomi couldn't read anything. He didn't speak a single word. He simply held his head in that position, turned toward her. for long enough that she could count 6 heartbeats. Then he turned back toward the sea. Naomi lowered her head, turned around, and walked quickly inside. She washed the tray in the kitchen and told no one what had happened. Throughout that evening, she waited for Mrs. Pomeroy to summon her, for Bruno to knock on her door, or for an envelope containing 4 days of wages to appear on her bed. Nothing happened. He hadn't thanked her. He hadn't dismissed her either. The following afternoon, Naomi carried the tray onto the veranda at 1 minute to 4, just as she did every day. Raphael was already sitting there. In the kitchen, the wall clock showed 3:50. Mrs. Pomeroy stood beside the sink and looked up, watching Naomi through the doorway without saying anything. But in the 5 years she had worked in this house, the master had never gone out to the veranda even 1 minute before 4 o'clock. That day, he had already been sitting there for 10 minutes. That Saturday, the Marchetti family car arrived at the gates at 11 o'clock, and Mrs. Pomeroy instructed everyone working in the kitchen not to pass through the large drawing room until afternoon unless they had a reason to be there. Priscilla Marchetti was 31 years old, the only daughter of Ambrose Marchetti in Providence, and she entered the house with the bearing of someone who already considered it hers. Attorney Ferrante followed behind her, carrying a file. On the drawing room table, they spread out the proposed plans for the wedding scheduled for March of the following year, still more than 6 months away, and Ferrante began reading through each item. Priscilla listened for approximately 10 minutes, then rose, walked to the liquor cabinet in the corner, poured a drink with her own hands, and carried it to where Raphael sat. She didn't summon a servant. She had never summoned a servant for that particular task. Ferrante was in the room. Bruno stood near the door, and one of the Marchetti family's men was seated in the corridor, and all 3 watched her carry the glass across the room herself. "I poured this for you," she said, lowering her voice and drawing out every word the way someone might speak to a child who had only just begun learning to talk. "It's the kind you always drink." Raphael touched the base of the glass with the back of his hand before taking it. He nodded once. Ferrante continued with the section concerning the guest list. Priscilla interrupted him halfway through. "I tried on the dress Tuesday, Raphael. They had to alter the waist twice before it fit. It's made of heavy silk, ivory rather than white, because pure white makes my face look washed out in photographs. They're adding lace to the sleeves in the old style, running all the way from the shoulders to the wrists, and the train is approximately 10 feet long. They said it will look perfect on the church carpet." She sat in the chair opposite him and smoothed the fabric of her dress across her knees. "I think I'll wear my hair up. Leaving it down makes me look too young." Then she fell silent. Ferrante cleared his throat and resumed reading. During the next 40 minutes, Priscilla Marchetti spoke about the flowers, the musicians, which family should be seated in the second row, and how the weather in Boston during March could never be trusted. She sat only 1 low table away from Raphael in a room where the midday sunlight poured diagonally through 3 tall windows and spread across the wooden floor, while beyond those windows the bay was so still that not a single ripple disturbed its surface. She didn't say one word about the room. Near 1 o'clock, Ferrante closed the file and mentioned one final administrative detail before leaving. Priscilla Marchetti's name had been added to the estate's internal expenditure approval list more than a year earlier. Ferrante himself had added it while preparing the marriage contract so that, whenever necessary, she could authorize household expenses without having to wait. Raphael nodded. It was 1 line in a file, 30 pages thick, and no one in the room gave it another second of thought. At 1:15, Mrs. Pomeroy sent Naomi in to clear the glasses. Naomi entered with her face lowered, walked directly to the low table, and arranged 3 glasses on the tray. She worked quickly and quietly. Priscilla was standing in the doorway with her coat draped over one arm, preparing to leave for the car. She stopped. She looked at Naomi. It wasn't the passing glance people ordinarily gave a servant clearing a table. She looked directly at her, from the shoes worn down at the heels to the lowered face, and held that gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned away and walked out to the car. Naomi carried the tray down to the kitchen. She thought nothing of it. Dr. Wendell Sloan arrived at the gates at 5 minutes to 7 on Thursday morning, exactly as he had every Thursday morning for the past 5 years. He didn't drive himself. The car stopped at the side entrance. The driver opened the door for him, and Dr. Sloan entered through the side door, leading directly to the small room at the end of the ground floor corridor. The room everyone in the house called the examination room, even though it contained nothing more than an armchair, a low table, and a porcelain sink in the corner. Sloan was 63 years old, with silver white hair combed straight back, and he carried the brown leather medical case he had used throughout his 22 years of service to the Corvino family. The case always contained exactly 3 things: a blood pressure monitor, a set of files with blue covers, and an amber glass bottle of eye drops, no larger than his thumb, bearing a printed label that read "Maintenance Solution for Chronic Corneal Damage." At exactly 7 o'clock, Raphael entered and sat in the armchair. Sloane placed the case on the low table, opened its 2 brass clasps, and began the same sequence he had performed more than 260 times. He wrapped the cuff around Raphael's left arm, inflated it, watched the needle climb and then descend, then recorded the reading in the blue-covered file with careful slanting handwriting. He removed the cuff, coiled the tube, and returned the monitor to the case. Then he took out the amber bottle. He twisted off the black cap and placed it on the table beside him. He stepped closer, rested one hand against Raphael's forehead, and slowly tilted his head backward to the exact angle he always used. Raphael removed his dark sunglasses and closed his eyes. He always closed his eyes at this moment. Sloane held the dropper above the right eye first and released 2 drops, one and then another. He waited several seconds, moved to the left eye, and administered 2 more. He counted softly under his breath as he always did. Raphael felt the cold liquid slide into the corners of his eyes and run toward his temples. He asked nothing. He never asked anything. The man bending over his face was the same man who had remained beside his bed throughout the first 3 nights after the explosion, when no one in the family knew whether Raphael would ever open his eyes again. And Rafael Corvino had never doubted a man who hadn't left that room when everyone else had gone. Sloane returned the dropper to the bottle and prepared to screw the black cap back into place. Before tightening it, he tapped the cap twice against the stone ring on the ring finger of his right hand. Click, click. It was a habit he had carried for years. A small, unconscious movement that even he didn't realize he still made. He returned the bottle to the case, opened the blue-covered file, and wrote another line beneath the blood pressure reading. Date, dose, no notes. Everything is stable this week, he said in the slow, distinct voice of someone speaking to a sick man. We'll continue just as we have been. Raphael put his dark sunglasses back on. All right. Sloane closed the case, fastened the clasps, and left through the side door. The car was already waiting at the side entrance. At 7:19, its door closed. In the kitchen, Mrs. Pomeroy looked at the clock and told Naomi that the doctor had left, so she could go down the hall and clean the examination room. And that brought them back to that August afternoon, 6 weeks after her arrival, the moment Naomi set down her cloth, drew her mother's penlight, and shone its beam straight into his eyes. Both pupils contracted sharply, and before she could pull away, Raphael's hand shot out and caught her wrist. What do you think you are doing? His voice wasn't loud. It was low and flat, and that was precisely what sent a chill down Naomi's spine. She sprang to her feet, and he released her hand at once. The penlight was still glowing in her hand, its beam falling at an angle across the carpet. She stepped back once, then twice, and could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Only one thought ran through her mind, that she had broken all 3 rules in 10 seconds, and Mrs. Pomeroy had made it perfectly clear that people in this house didn't repeat themselves a second time. Raphael Corvino had risen from the chair. He stood nearly 2 heads taller than she did, and his face was turned directly toward the place where she stood. I'll ask you only once more. Naomi opened her mouth. No sound emerged. She swallowed, tightened her hand around the penlight, and thought of her mother. Sir, her voice trembled, but she spoke every word clearly. Your pupils still constrict when light shines into them. No one in the drawing room said anything for approximately 3 seconds. Both of them, she continued, and this time her voice trembled a little less because she had begun speaking about something she understood. I shone the light into your right eye, and the pupil constricted. I shone it into your left eye, and that one constricted too. I checked a second time to make sure. What do you know about eyes? I studied for 2 years to become an ophthalmic technician in Lowell. I didn't finish the program. You didn't finish. No, sir. Raphael remained still, one hand resting against the back of the chair. Get out, he said. Naomi lowered her head, picked up the cleaning cloth from the table, and left. She didn't dare run, but she walked very quickly, and she didn't slam the door because that was the first rule. Raphael listened to her footsteps, travel the entire length of the corridor, turn left at the end, then disappear in the direction of the kitchen. He sat down again. His mind worked very quickly. It always had, and that was why he occupied the position he held. It arranged the facts before him in their proper order. 4 specialists, not one. 4 doctors in 4 different cities, each with a private practice, each with a reputation of his own to protect. And all 4 had examined the same set of images and signed the same conclusion. The optic nerve was dead. There was nothing more to be done. Raphael had sat listening while Sloane read that conclusion aloud to the entire family in the dining room. He had heard his aunt crying at the far end of the table, and he hadn't spoken for the rest of that evening. The young woman who had just left was a servant who had worked in his house for 6 weeks, studied for 2 years without finishing, and carried an old penlight in her apron pocket. He had spent 5 years learning not to hope. It was the most expensive lesson he had ever learned, and he had paid its full price. During the first 6 months, he had traveled to 3 cities. He had sat in 3 different examination rooms and listened to 3 different men deliver the same sentence in 3 different voices. By the 4th doctor, he no longer traveled. He had learned that every time he allowed himself to believe in a possibility, he was forced to climb up from the bottom again, and each time, that bottom became deeper. He had no intention of making that climb again because of a maid and a penlight. He reached for the cup of tea on the table. It had long since gone cold. Outside, the last daylight had completely faded, and no one switched on the lamps in the drawing room, because in this house, people didn't need to turn on lights for him. He remained in that chair for a very long time after the sound of her footsteps had vanished. 3 hours later, when Naomi was folding napkins in the kitchen and had almost begun to believe she would be left alone, Bruno Tesoro appeared in the doorway and said the master wanted to see her in his study. Mrs. Pomeroy looked up at Naomi once, then immediately lowered her gaze, and no one in the kitchen said anything. Naomi removed her apron, smoothed her hair, and followed Bruno to the 2nd floor. He knocked twice, opened the door, then remained outside and closed it behind her. Raphael was seated behind the desk, still wearing his dark sunglasses, and there was nothing on the desktop except a pen and a stack of blank paper. Naomi stopped at the edge of the rug and waited. Then he rose, walked around the desk, pulled a chair away from the wall, and placed it opposite his own, less than 3 feet away. "Sit down." Naomi didn't move. During the 6 weeks she had been there, she had never seen any member of the household staff sit in any room on this floor, and she had never heard anyone suggest that such a thing was possible. "Sit down," he repeated, and she sat. He lowered himself into the chair opposite her, placed both hands on his knees, and leaned slightly forward until his face was level with hers. "Tell me again, slowly. Don't use any word because you think I won't understand it, and don't leave anything out because you think I don't need to know." Naomi drew a breath. "Sir, there's a small ring of muscle inside the human eye. When a strong light shines into it, that ring automatically contracts to reduce the amount of light entering. It isn't something a person can control. No one can pretend to do it, or deliberately stop it from happening. Go on." That reflex follows a nerve pathway from the back of the eye into the brain, and then back out again. If that nerve pathway is completely dead, the eye won't constrict anymore. When someone shines a light into it, the pupil remains still. My mother's eyes were like that during the final 3 years of her life. I checked them every evening, because she asked me to, and they remained still. They didn't move at all. Naomi paused, then spoke the rest more slowly. "Your eyes constricted, both of them, quickly and decisively." Raphael didn't move. "Are you certain?" "I'm not certain," she answered immediately without evasion. "I studied for only 2 years, and didn't finish. I've never been qualified to sign anyone's medical records. I wouldn't dare tell you that you can see because I don't know. The front of your eyes may be damaged so severely that not enough light can enter, and I can't determine that merely by standing outside and shining a light." "Then what are you certain of?" Naomi looked up, and she forgot the 3rd rule. She stared directly into his dark sunglasses. "I'm certain no one has taken new images of your eyes in 5 years. Those 4 specialists signed their names to the same set of images taken shortly after you were injured. Images from 5 years ago show the eyes you had 5 years ago, sir. They aren't the eyes sitting in this room today." The room remained silent for a very long time. Naomi could hear the wind outside the window and the sound of a car traveling along the distant coastal road. Then Raphael spoke, and his voice had changed. It was lower and slower. "Who told you to do what you did this afternoon?" "No one, sir. I was cleaning the table when I saw something glint inside your left eye, as the sunlight came through at an angle. I didn't think. I simply took out the penlight." "Weren't you afraid?" "I was, sir. I was so afraid that I'm still afraid now." Raphael straightened. He raised a hand, removed his dark sunglasses, and placed them on his knee. And Naomi saw his eyes for the first time in ordinary light. 2 pale scars spread like mist across the dark brown beneath. Nothing at all like her mother's eyes. "Listen carefully," he said. "From now on, if you notice anything in this house that isn't where it should be, you tell me. You don't tell anyone else." 6 days passed and nothing happened. No one summoned Naomi to the 2nd floor again. No one mentioned what had occurred that afternoon, and she began to suspect that perhaps the master had decided to pretend it had never happened. On Thursday morning, Mrs. Pomeroy assigned her to arrange the clean linens in the linen room at the end of the ground floor corridor. A narrow little room with only enough space for 2 rows of shelves and a folding table, located directly beside the examination room. Naomi entered at 10 minutes to 7, left the door open approximately 1.5 inches, as people usually did to keep the room from becoming stifling, then bent down and began folding the first stack of towels. At 5 minutes to 7, she heard footsteps in the corridor, the examination room door opening and closing, and the 2 brass clasps of a medical case snapping open. She hadn't intended to look. She folded 4 more towels and raised her head only because she heard running water, and she knew the sink in the examination room wasn't used on Thursday mornings because Mrs. Pomeroy had instructed them to wipe it dry every Wednesday night and leave not a single drop behind. From where Naomi stood, through the narrow opening in the door, she could see only a thin strip of the adjoining room, and within that strip were 1 corner of the low table and the entire porcelain sink against the wall. Dr. Sloane was bending over the sink. He held the amber bottle in his right hand with the cap removed, tilting it downward over the drain. The liquid poured out in a slow, dark stream, and it continued for quite some time. Naomi saw him run his thumb along the side of the bottle as though measuring the amount, then return it to an upright position. Less than half of the liquid remained. He turned on the faucet for several seconds to wash away everything he had poured out, then shut it off. Afterward, he reached inside his jacket, not into the outer pocket, but into a pocket sewn into the lining on the inner left side, and withdrew a second bottle. This one was smaller, made of clear glass, and had no label. The liquid inside was much paler, almost transparent. He removed the cap from the smaller bottle, placed its mouth against the opening of the amber bottle, and began to pour. He poured very slowly, stopping once midway to look before continuing, and stopped completely when the liquid in the amber bottle rose to precisely the level where it had been at the beginning. He replaced the cap on the smaller bottle, returned it to the inner pocket of his jacket, then smoothed the front of the fabric. Next, he screwed the black cap onto the amber bottle, held it in his palm, and shook it gently 3 times, each movement slow and controlled, never forceful. Naomi remained motionless. She didn't know what she had just witnessed. She remembered only every detail with perfect clarity. The dark liquid flowing into the drain, the pocket sewn inside the jacket, the unlabeled bottle containing the paler liquid, and the 3 measured shakes. Before moving away from the sink, Sloane raised his head and swept his gaze around the room. He looked toward the window. He looked toward the main door. He looked toward the upper left corner of the ceiling, then toward the upper right. Naomi stepped back half a pace, pressed herself against the shelves, and stopped breathing. His gaze passed across the narrow opening in the door without pausing. He turned away, returned the amber bottle to his case, and sat beside the low table. At exactly 7 o'clock, Naomi heard the examination room door open and the master's footsteps enter. She lowered her head and continued folding her stack of towels, never looking up again during the next 19 minutes. When she heard the brass clasp snap shut a second time and the side door close, she began counting Sloane's footsteps as they receded along the stone corridor, counting the way her mother had taught her to count as a child whenever thunder came, and she reached 31 before she could no longer hear anything. Shortly after 7:20 that morning, Mrs. Pomeroy sent Naomi to clean the examination room, as she did every Thursday. And while Naomi was kneeling to wipe the legs of the armchair, her hand touched something hard lying near the edge of the rug. The driver had accidentally brushed his heavy coat against the chair arm while carrying the medical case earlier that morning, snagging and tearing the loose pin from his lapel, leaving it hidden in the darkness beneath the chair. She picked it up and settled back on her heels, turning it beneath the light from the window. She remembered what the master had told her 6 days earlier, and instead of throwing it into the trash basket, she slipped it into her apron pocket. A few minutes later, when Bruno passed through the kitchen, she told him she needed to see the master. Bruno looked at her once, then told her to follow him. In the second-floor study, Naomi placed the object on the desk before Raphael and said she had found it beneath the armchair in the examination room, near the right leg, in a place she had cleaned the previous morning when nothing had been there. Raphael extended his hand and traced the surface of the desk until he touched it, then picked it up. He turned it between 2 fingers, running his thumb across the front, and then the back. "There's a pin on the back," he said. "Yes, sir. A short pin with a spring clasp. The kind used to attach a badge to a lapel. It's heavy. Cast metal, not thin-stamped metal." He placed it face up in his palm. "Describe it to me. Don't leave out a single detail." Naomi bent closer and examined it carefully. It's round, approximately the size of a quarter. The background is covered in dark blue enamel, the blue of deep seawater rather than green. In the center is an anchor in a brass gold color, with a straight vertical shank and 2 curved flukes rising on either side. Behind the anchor are 3 parallel diagonal lines in the same brass gold color, running from the lower left to the upper right. At the very bottom, close to the rim, there are 3 capital letters, H, L, M. They're engraved into the metal rather than raised, and blue enamel remains inside the carved lines. Is the enamel chipped anywhere? Yes, sir. On the upper right edge, a small piece is missing, exposing the metal beneath. The exposed place has already tarnished. It isn't bright like a fresh impact. Raphael said nothing for a while. He continued holding the pin in his palm, his thumb resting directly over the 3 letters, A, L, M. For 12 years, he had sat at negotiating tables with nearly every prominent company along the waterfront, from Chelsea to Quincy. And before losing his sight, he had been the person who read every line of every contract, rather than listening while someone else read for him. Those 3 letters meant nothing to him. "Does anyone in this house wear a lapel pin?" he asked. "I haven't seen anyone wearing one, sir." "Does Dr. Sloan?" "No, sir. The lapels of his jacket are plain. I noticed because I always hang his coat on the hook in the corridor." Raphael placed the pin on the desk. "Who entered that room this morning?" "Dr. Sloan, sir." "And you?" She paused. "And one other person. He never drives himself. Someone brings him here. Just a little while ago, the driver carried his medical case inside for him, placed it on the low table, then left immediately. I don't think he was in the room for even 1 minute. What was he wearing?" "A gray canvas jacket, sir. The kind laborers wear, with a pocket on the chest. It wasn't a suit jacket." Raphael sat perfectly still. Over 5 years, this house had become the only map he still possessed in its entirety. 84 steps, from his bedroom door to the foot of the staircase. 16 people whose names and voices he knew, along with the precise way each person placed a foot upon the floor. He had survived by believing that nothing moved within those 4 walls without his knowledge. And that morning, inside the room where he sat every Thursday, less than 3 feet from his chair, a man had been standing without Raphael ever knowing he was there. He raised his hand and closed his fingers around the pin. That evening, Raphael summoned Bruno to the study and closed the door, then told him everything, beginning with the pen light on the previous Friday afternoon and ending with the lapel pin resting in the top drawer. Bruno listened without interrupting once. When Raphael finished, Bruno asked only one question: what the master wanted him to do. Raphael told him to obtain a small amount of the liquid from the amber bottle without allowing anyone to know, including anyone inside the house, especially anyone inside the house. The following Thursday, Dr. Sloan entered the examination room at 5 minutes to 7 as usual, and during the 9th minute, he rose and went to wash his hands in the small restroom off the corridor, as he did midway through every examination. He left the brown leather case open on the low table. Bruno Tesoro had exactly 4 minutes. He had prepared a small glass vial with a rubber stopper. He opened the amber bottle, withdrew approximately half a teaspoon, sealed the vial, wiped the mouth of the bottle clean with a tissue, screwed the black cap back into place, then returned the bottle to the exact position and angle in which it had been lying. He left the room after 2 minutes and 15 seconds. That afternoon, Bruno drove to Worcester alone without taking anyone with him, and delivered the sample to a private laboratory on the 3rd floor of an old office building, a place that had never performed any work for the Corvino family and had never heard the name. He paid in cash. He wrote a non-existent name on the form. He requested that the results be sent to a monthly rented post office box in Quincy, with no email and no telephone call. The technician receiving the sample asked what Bruno wanted them to test for, and Bruno said, "Tell me what's inside it. Everything that's inside it. I'm not looking for anything in particular." 6 days later, on a Wednesday evening, Bruno brought a brown envelope without a return address to the study. Raphael told him to read it. Bruno opened the envelope, removed 3 sheets of paper, and read slowly, 1 line at a time, including the lines he didn't understand. The bottle contained 4 components. The first 3 were ordinary solvents and preservatives, nothing of significance. The 4th component, which accounted for most of the active effect, wasn't an anti-inflammatory substance. The laboratory stated that it was a derivative with the opposite effect, something used in research to keep eye tissue in a state of continuous inflammation. At the bottom of the 2nd page, they had added 1 sentence in the flat, emotionless language laboratories always used, stating that the method of use described by the client wasn't consistent with any therapeutic purpose known to them. Bruno finished reading and placed the paper on the desk. Raphael said nothing. He remained motionless with both hands resting on the desktop, while a calculation began running through his mind and he couldn't stop it. 52 weeks in a year. 5 years. 2 drops in the right eye and 2 in the left. 4 drops every week. He performed the multiplication 3 times in his head because the first time he couldn't believe the number. 1,040 drops. He had tilted his head backward and closed his eyes 1,040 times. Each time, he had removed his dark sunglasses with his own hands. He had thanked that man hundreds of times, sent gifts to his home on 2 holidays, and risen to shake his hand at his sister's funeral. It took Raphael a long time to exhale. "Boss," Bruno said softly from the far end of the room. "Who do you suspect?" Raphael turned his face toward the voice. "Everyone in this house," he said, "except 2 people." Bruno didn't need to ask who they were. He knew that one of them was himself, and he knew that the other was in the room at the end of the servants' wing. The woman he had met at the iron gates 6 weeks earlier asked 3 questions and received 3 truthful answers. At 2 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the black car left the estate through the northern service gate with its headlights off, and Bruno didn't switch them on until they had passed the windbreak at the end of the drive. Raphael's phone remained on the desk in the second-floor study, still powered on and resting exactly where anyone in the house would expect it to be. Naomi sat beside him in the back seat, with the blue-covered medical file in her lap, the same file Bruno had removed from Dr. Sloane's case on Thursday morning and would return to its proper place before 6 o'clock the following morning. She had come because Raphael needed someone who could read whatever was placed before him. The imaging clinic occupied the 3rd floor of a building in Back Bay and remained open throughout the night for people who didn't want to share a waiting room with anyone. The attendant asked no name and requested no insurance information. The scan took 22 minutes. At 4:10, Dr. Ingrid Halverson entered the reading room. She was 57 years old, with short salt and pepper hair, and she offered no greeting. She pulled a chair before the monitor and began examining the images. She studied them for 11 minutes. She enlarged them twice and rotated the slices 3 times. Then she turned her chair toward Raphael and spoke directly to his face without lowering her voice, drawing out her words, or using the tone people adopted when speaking to a blind man. "Your optic nerves are alive, both of them." Naomi heard herself draw a breath. "Your damage is in the front of the eyes, not the back. Your corneas suffered chemical burns and developed cloudy scarring. The scars are patchy rather than complete, and there's a relatively clear area along the outer edge of the left cornea. That's why enough light can still enter for your pupil to react. Put simply, the part that receives light is damaged, but the part that carries the signal to your brain remains intact." Raphael sat motionless. "This can be treated with a transplant," Halverson said. "A corneal transplant. I performed my first one 29 years ago, and I've completed more than 2,000 since then." She paused. "But it can't be done on an inflamed eye. If the eye is inflamed, the graft will be rejected. There are no exceptions. Not one doctor in this country would operate on an eye in that condition." Naomi heard Raphael's hand tighten around the arm of the chair. In her mind, the 3 pages from Worcester and the sentence Halverson had just spoken came together into a single image, and she understood approximately 2 seconds before Raphael did that the liquid hadn't been placed in his eyes to make him blinder. It had been used to keep him permanently ineligible for treatment. Raphael extended the blue-covered file toward the table. Halverson pulled it closer and opened it. She turned the pages quickly at first, then more slowly, and finally stopped. "4 conclusions," she said. 4 different doctors in 4 different cities, signed across a period of 11 months. All 4 relied on a single set of images, the set taken during the first week after the accident. Not one of those 4 doctors ever examined your eyes, Mr. Corvino. They saw only a collection of images someone sent to them. She continued turning pages. "And here are 3 orders for new imaging. 1 in the 7th month, 1 in the 2nd year, and 1 in the 4th year. All 3 were cancelled." She turned the file around, even though the man sitting before her couldn't see it, then spoke to Naomi. "Read him the signature beneath those 3 cancellation stamps." Naomi bent over the pages. 3 careful, slanting signatures, identical, written with the same kind of pen across 4 years. "Wendell A. Sloane," she read. Halverson turned to page 11 and placed her finger on a line buried among the others in the original description. "And this has been in your record for 5 years." Naomi read the line, and her voice went dry halfway through the sentence. "Small metallic foreign body located behind the left iris. Inert. No intervention required." "This handwriting," Halverson said, "is the same handwriting we just saw." No one in the room spoke for a long time. Then Halverson rose and opened her appointment book. I have an operating room available Monday morning at 7:15. I have 4 conditions, and I won't negotiate any of them. You won't be admitted under your real name, no insurance, your family doctor won't be notified, and no one in your house can know where you are. Raphael nodded 4 times, once for each condition. On Saturday afternoon, Raphael summoned both of them to the study and told Bruno to close the door. He said the story told inside this house would be that he was traveling to Miami for 4 days to meet with a port owner, that he was flying privately, and that he hadn't announced his return date in advance. If anyone asked, they were to answer with those exact words, adding nothing and omitting nothing. If Miss Marchetti asked, they were to give her the same answer. Bruno nodded and said he had finished arranging the car and the men the previous evening. Raphael turned toward Naomi. Did you understand everything? Yes, sir. Do you understand what will happen to you if anyone in this house discovers where I'm going? I understand, sir. She didn't ask where he was going. She didn't ask whether the operation was dangerous, how long it would take before they knew the result, or what would happen if it failed. Nor did she ask the question anyone in her position would have been thinking, what would happen to her if everything were exposed. She simply stood there with both hands resting before her apron, waiting to see whether there was anything else. That's all, Raphael said. You may go downstairs. Naomi turned to leave. Her hand had already settled on the doorknob. Miss Fletcher. She stopped and turned back. Raphael remained seated behind the desk with his face directed toward her, and he wasn't wearing his dark sunglasses. For 5 years, someone had arranged his plate at every meal. Someone had brought the car around to wait at the entrance. Someone had read his contracts aloud, and someone had supported his elbow at the foot of the staircase every morning. He had accepted all of it the way people accepted air, because in this house they performed those tasks for him because he paid their wages, and because he had learned early that if a man in his position thanked a servant, all of Boston would know within a week that the Corvino boss had grown weak. He hadn't spoken those words to anyone in 5 years. Thank you, he said. Naomi remained motionless for a moment. Then she said, Yes, sir, so softly that the words were almost soundless, and she walked out, closing the door very gently behind her in accordance with the first rule of this house. At 7:15 on Monday morning, the operating room doors on the 8th floor closed, and Bruno Tesoro sat down in the 3rd chair from the end of the hallway. He held a paper cup of coffee. By the end of the first hour, it had gone cold. During the second, he set it on the floor. There were 17 floor tiles between his chair and those doors, and over the next 6 hours, he counted them more times than he cared to admit. At 1:20 in the afternoon, the doors opened. Dr. Halverson pulled her mask below her chin. She said the cornea in Raphael's right eye had been replaced. The graft was in position, and there had been no complications during surgery. She said the piece of metal behind the iris of his left eye had been removed intact. Then she told him that no one could promise anything for the next 48 hours, and not to ask her for odds. She reached into the pocket of her surgical gown and took out a clear plastic specimen tube with a printed label and a black screw cap. Bruno held it in his palm. Resting motionless at the bottom was a dark fragment of metal, roughly 1/8 of an inch long, with one edge cut straight and the other beveled at an angle. He stared at it for a long time, before closing his fingers around it. The recovery room was on the 4th floor. Raphael Corvino woke at 5:04 the following morning. At first, there was still darkness. He had awakened inside that darkness 1,800 times before, so he knew it well. He knew the way it enclosed his face. He knew it had no bottom and no edges, but he lay still for several more seconds. And then he realized that this darkness was not the same as the other one. It had shades. One place was darker than another, and in the upper left corner, it gradually grew paler. He didn't move. The faint patch widened very slowly. It was gray. It wasn't a point of light. It was a shape, and that shape had borders. The border on the left was straight. The one above it was straight as well. The two met at a right angle. It was a rectangle. His eyes burned, and tears spilled from them, blurring everything. He had to blink several times, and after each blink, the rectangle became a little clearer. He stared at it for a length of time he couldn't measure. Then he understood that it was a window. Beyond that window, the sky was beginning to brighten. His right hand found the bed rail and closed around it. He gripped it so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and his hand remained there, perfectly still, while the rest of his body lay utterly motionless. The nurse call button was clipped to the rail less than 8 inches from his hand. He didn't press it. He didn't call for anyone. He simply lay there and looked. He watched the sky change from gray to something paler than gray, then soften into pink along the lower edge. He saw something dark and slender cutting across the pale glass, not a distinct image yet, but a shape with sharp edges. It took him a long while to realize he was looking at a power line outside. He looked up at the blurred outline of the ivory ceiling. 5 years earlier, he had spent 11 days in a room just like this one, and even now, he still didn't know what color that ceiling had been. 200 people had come to his sister's funeral, and he had stood in the front row and shaken every one of their hands without seeing a single face. He looked at that ivory ceiling and lay perfectly still, and somewhere within those 11 minutes, the part of him that had always calculated so quickly began calculating again. If he called the nurse, the hospital would have a record within an hour. If he returned home able to see, all 16 people in that house would know within a day. The man who had put 1,040 drops into his eyes would know, and whoever stood behind that man, the one whose face and name Raphael still didn't know, would have enough time to retreat and erase everything before Raphael could reach him. For 5 years, everyone in that house had spoken around him as if he weren't there. Now he possessed something no one knew he had. At the 12th minute, footsteps sounded in the hallway, and the door handle turned. Raphael Corvino closed his eyes, loosened the hand gripping the bed rail, and kept his breathing as steady as the breathing of a man asleep. The plastic specimen tube had been sent out the week before to a materials analysis laboratory in New Jersey that had never handled any work for the Corvino family, and the report arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a brown envelope with no return address, 27 pages thick. Most of those pages contained alloy composition charts, microscope images, and technical figures Raphael didn't need to understand. The conclusion appeared on the second page, and it consisted of only 3 lines. The metal fragment wasn't a random piece of something destroyed in the explosion. Its surface bore the marks of precision manufacturing, with one edge cut straight by an industrial die and the other beveled at a standard angle. It was part of a safety rupture disc, the thin metal component installed on industrial compressed air tanks to burst when the pressure exceeded its limit. Raphael told Bruno to read those 3 lines again, then sat in silence for a very long time. His family's laundry plant in Chelsea handled linens from waterfront hotels and ships arriving in port, which meant all the pressurized equipment supplies used there had always come from a waterfront distributor, not a domestic equipment manufacturer. On page 11, the laboratory reported that under 50 times magnification, they had found a sequence of 7 characters stamped into the beveled edge. Some had been blurred by heat, but every one of them remained legible. The report went on to explain that the sequence was a production lot number, that federal regulations required every safety rupture disc used on an industrial compressed air tank to carry such a number, that every lot of this kind had to be declared and documented when manufactured and distributed, and that every pair of hands that had ever received that shipment had been required to sign a piece of paper. Bruno was already one step ahead of him. He had hired a private investigation firm in Hartford that the Corvino family had never used, paid through an account that didn't bear the family name, and given them one task without providing any context at all: trace those 7 characters back to the place where the shipment had left the factory. 9 days later, on a Saturday night, the report arrived, 31 pages long. The lot of safety rupture discs bearing that number had been manufactured at a plant in Pennsylvania and distributed to 3 buyers. A construction company in New Hampshire received the smallest portion. An equipment maintenance contractor in Connecticut received the second, and 40% of the shipment went to a company called Harbor Line Marine Supply, registered at an address in Quincy, Massachusetts. Raphael told Bruno to turn to page 19. It contained a list of shareholders. The controlling interest in Harbor Line belonged to a limited liability company registered in Delaware, and that Delaware company also held shares in 4 other businesses scattered along the coast. Bruno read the names of those 4 businesses aloud. The first 2 were waterfront terminals where Raphael had sat across the negotiating table for 6 straight years, shaking hands, signing contracts, and sharing dinner on at least 4 occasions. Both belonged to the Marchetti family. Bruno stopped reading. He turned back to the cover and said that in the upper right corner, the investigation firm had reproduced the Harbor Line logo in black ink. Raphael told him to describe it: an anchor with a straight vertical shank and 2 flukes curving upward. Behind it were 3 parallel diagonal lines, running from the lower left to the upper right. Beneath them were 3 capital letters: H-L-M. Raphael opened the top drawer and took out the lapel pin Naomi had found beneath the chair in the examination room. He placed it on the desk beside the report's cover, so close that the 2 almost touched, and ran one finger over the dark blue enamel for the final time. The compressed air tank had exploded in the chemical mixing room of the laundry plant at 9:20 on the evening of May 14th, 5 years earlier. Chelsea police had ruled it an industrial accident. The case had been closed after 7 weeks, and no one had been prosecuted. For 5 years, Rafael Corvino had believed his sister died because of a faulty tank. At 1 o'clock in the morning, after every light in the estate had gone dark, Rafael Corvino sat alone in his study on the second floor and opened the second drawer on the left. He lifted out the envelope with both hands, just as he had done almost every week for 5 years. But this time, he placed it face up on the desk beneath the pool of light from the lamp. And this time, he saw it. The paper had faded to a pale yellow along all 4 edges. The date marked on the envelope read, May 14th. The ink worn faint with age, but every letter still legible. And on the front, beneath the address, was a handwritten line he had avoided touching for 5 years. The letters slanting to the right, written quickly, the final stroke of each word flicking slightly upward, for Raphael. He took the letter opener from the pen holder and slid it beneath the upper edge. The glue had grown brittle, and the paper tore open in a jagged line instead of a straight one. Inside were 2 sheets of paper folded into thirds. He unfolded them and began to read. I can't send this over the phone. 3 times I've stood there holding the receiver, and 3 times I've put it down again. Because if I say this and I'm wrong, I'll ruin everything. And if I say it and I'm right, then I don't know who else may be listening on the other end anymore. So I'm writing it down. Do you remember back in February when you said 2 shipments from cold storage warehouse number 2 didn't match the books, and you told me to leave it alone for the time being? I didn't leave it alone. I asked the carrier for their manifests, and I compared them for 3 straight months. Our shipments leave Chelsea with everything accounted for, but they don't go directly to New York the way the paperwork says they do. They turn south toward Providence, remain there overnight, and then continue on. And every time that happens, the weight declared when they leave is different from the weight recorded when they arrived. I found out who signed the orders to divert them. Raphael, that person is inside our own family. I'm not writing the name here, not because I'm afraid you won't believe me, but because I'm afraid this envelope may never reach your hands. I have copies of everything in my pocket. I'm going to the plant at 7 tonight to collect the last document from the records office. Then I'll wait for you there, and I'll show you every page, one by one, and after that, you can decide what to do. I'm not afraid, so don't worry. I just don't want to do this alone anymore. Beneath the signature, in the left margin, was another line written far more hastily than the rest. The ink darker, because the pen had been pressed harder against the paper. Remember to eat dinner before you come. You always forget. Raphael read the letter again from the beginning. He read it a 3rd time. On the 5th, he laid the 2 sheets beside each other on the desk and read more slowly, pausing after every sentence. On the 7th, he simply read the pages without hearing any of the words inside his mind. On the 9th, he stopped reading the words altogether. He lowered the desk lamp and studied the ink. On the 4th line, there was a place where it had gathered into a tiny bead because the pen had remained still for too long. 1 word had been crossed out and written again beside it. In the lower right corner of the first page, the paper held a faint indentation shaped like a crescent, the place where a thumb had pressed down to keep the sheet from slipping while she wrote. He placed his own thumb over that exact mark. Hers had been so much smaller than his. He sat that way without moving, while the desk lamp continued to burn. Near 3 o'clock in the morning, the study door opened by the width of a hand. Naomi Fletcher stood in the hallway. She had been passing by when she noticed the line of light beneath the door. She didn't knock. She didn't ask anything. She stepped 3 paces into the room, set a glass of water on the low cabinet beside the door, then withdrew into the hallway, sat down on the wooden floor, drew her knees up, and rested her back against the wall. Raphael didn't turn around. He knew she was there. Neither of them spoke a single word for the rest of that night. At 5:15, the light from the east crept across the floor and reached the center of the room. Naomi rose, picked up the glass of water that had gone cool, and went downstairs to the kitchen. It began with something very small. So small that if anyone else had been sitting where Priscilla Marchetti sat that morning, they wouldn't have noticed it at all. She had come to the estate to finish discussing the guest list, and while she was speaking, a servant carried in a tray and set a cup of tea on the low table to Raphael's right. Raphael reached out to take the cup. He reached first. Before the base of the cup touched the table, before there was any sound to tell him it had arrived, Priscilla was halfway through a sentence about carnations, and she finished that sentence without pausing or changing her tone. But she remembered. She said nothing about it during the remaining 2 hours, and she continued speaking to him in the same slow, drawn-out voice she had used for 5 years. 3 days later, she returned in the afternoon without warning. Raphael was standing before one of the tall windows in the great living room, his back to the door, and Priscilla entered, walked around the leather armchair, and stopped exactly 4 steps behind him, directly within his line of sight, if he had possessed one. She carried nothing in her hands. She raised her right hand to shoulder height and held up 3 fingers. "Raphael," she said in the most naturally cheerful voice she could manage. "I just stopped at the flower shop downtown. Guess how many flowers I'm holding?" The 3 raised fingers remained suspended in the air. Raphael didn't turn around at once. He allowed exactly the length of silence a blind man would need to locate the voice that had just spoken. Then he turned, angling himself about a handspan to the right of where she stood, far enough that his face wasn't directed toward hers, but toward the empty space beside her shoulder. He frowned. "What flowers?" For the next 2 seconds, neither of them spoke. "Did you buy flowers?" he asked, his voice carrying precisely the faint impatience of a man who had just been asked a question that made no sense. "I didn't hear the rustle of paper or stems, Priscilla. You walked in empty-handed." "Oh," Priscilla lowered her hand. "No, I was only teasing you. I meant to buy some, but the shop was closed." She laughed, a short, light sound. "I'm sorry. That was a foolish joke." "Yes." Raphael turned back toward the window. Priscilla remained there a moment longer, then said she had to leave, kissed her fingertips, and touched them to his shoulder as she passed, just as she always did. When she reached the hallway, she slowed down. She was the only daughter of Ambrose Marchetti, and she had been raised in a house where children were taught that the most dangerous thing wasn't a powerful enemy, but something that didn't fit. The test she had just performed had come back clean. He had turned too far to one side. He had frowned at exactly the right moment. He had even pointed out that she had entered empty-handed, exactly what a blind man relying on his ears would infer after hearing no wrapping paper or stems set down. It was all so clean that Priscilla stopped in the middle of the hallway and felt no relief whatsoever. She didn't return to the living room. She didn't ask Raphael another question. She didn't ask Bruno Tesoro or Mrs. Pomeroy. She had spent enough time in that house to know that when you wanted to pry something loose, you didn't go after the strongest link. She descended the front steps, got into her car, and throughout the drive back to Providence, she thought of only one person, the woman she had caught 3 times in the past 3 weeks standing alone with him on the back porch at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, talking to him. On Friday afternoon, Raphael and Bruno went to Boston to meet with attorney Ferrante about the cold storage records, and everyone in the house knew they wouldn't return before dark. At 4 o'clock, Priscilla Marchetti summoned the director of the estate's property management office to the small reception room on the 1st floor and told him to bring her the employment contract of a woman named Naomi Fletcher. He brought it to her. 3 pages. Priscilla read all 3, including the fine print at the bottom, and stopped at the final clause, the one stating that the head of the household could terminate the agreement at any time by written notice, effective immediately. It took her 4 minutes to write the termination notice. She signed her name beneath it and pushed the paper back across the table. And because Priscilla Marchetti's name had appeared on the estate's internal expense authorization list for more than a year, placed there by attorney Ferrante himself when he drafted the marriage agreement, her signature carried legal authority without requiring anyone else's approval. The director looked at the paper a little longer than people ordinarily looked at something that had just been handed to them. Then he picked it up and left. At 5:15, 2 members of the estate security team knocked on the door of the last room in the servants' quarters. They didn't raise their voices. They passed the notice through the opening in the door. Naomi read it once, then read it a second time, and she didn't ask either man a single question. She went back into the room, took out her canvas bag, and packed only her essential belongings: 3 sets of clothes, the penlight, and the debt notice folded into quarters inside her wallet. She left her uniform on the side of the bed, folded into a neat square. At 5:30, she stepped into the hallway with the bag in her hand. Priscilla was standing at the top of the main staircase, one hand resting on the banister as she looked down. "She isn't to speak to anyone else," Priscilla said. She addressed the 2 men, not Naomi, and her voice was as calm as if she were giving instructions about a shipment. Then she turned away. The black car drove through the side gate and turned south. Naomi sat in the back seat with the canvas bag on her lap, and the moment the car passed beyond the line of trees, she realized it wasn't heading toward Somerville, wasn't going toward the bus terminal, and wasn't traveling in any direction where someone who had just been dismissed from her job ought to have been taken. The 2 men in front didn't exchange a word. No one turned on the radio. After about 20 minutes, the man in the passenger seat turned around and told her to hand over her phone. Naomi took the old phone from her coat pocket and passed it forward. He took it, switched it off, slipped it into his own pocket, and said nothing more. No one asked where she wanted to be taken. No one asked whether she had any family to call. No one gave her the wages she was still owed, which, under the very clause she had just read, should have been paid at the same time as the notice. Naomi sat perfectly still, and she began to understand that this wasn't about removing a servant from the house. It was about taking someone beyond the reach of anyone who might hear her. She thought of 4 o'clock every afternoon on the back porch. She thought of the gap of barely 1.5 inches in the linen room door and the porcelain sink beyond it. She thought of the 3 letters engraved into the dark blue enamel, every detail of which she had described to the master, and she understood that inside that house there was exactly one person who had seen the things no one was ever meant to see, and that person was sitting in the back seat of this car. The car turned onto the beltway and continued south for another half-hour. The headlights of an approaching truck swept through the interior, and in that instant, Naomi saw the lapel of the canvas work jacket worn by the man in the front seat. Pinned to it was the very same round badge Naomi had found beneath the armchair weeks ago. The dark blue enamel glinting faintly in the dark, bearing the anchor and those 3 letters, H-L-M. Naomi tightened both hands around the canvas bag on her lap and stared straight ahead, allowing nothing she had seen to show on her face. At 6:10, Raphael's car stopped on the gravel drive. He stepped out and walked straight inside, without passing through the main foyer or removing his coat. Down the corridor connecting the main house to the servants' quarters, along the row of rooms until he reached the final door. It wasn't locked. Inside, the blanket had been pulled smooth across the single bed. The gray uniform lay at the foot of it, folded into a neat square. All 3 drawers of the small dresser stood wide open and empty. Raphael stood in the middle of that room without saying a word. Behind him, at the far end of the hallway, Shoes descended the main staircase. Her contract was no longer suitable, Priscilla Marchetti said. I signed the termination papers this afternoon. She spoke from behind him, nearly 25 feet away, using her real voice, the sharp, quick voice he had heard at the foot of the stairs that night, the voice she had never once used in front of him during those 5 years. She didn't lower it. She didn't draw out her words. She didn't need to, because the man before her had his back turned. He couldn't see her lips. He couldn't see her face. He couldn't see anything at all. Raphael didn't turn around. Which car did they take? He asked quietly, almost casually, in the voice of a man asking what time a train departed. Priscilla was stepping onto the 3rd stair from the bottom when she stopped completely. Her hand remained on the banister. She had spoken from behind him. He couldn't see her. There was no possible way he could have known she was speaking. And yet he had answered her. Raphael turned. He raised one hand, removed the dark glasses, folded one arm against the lenses, and looked directly into her face. In 5 years of sitting at the same table, signing the same set of contracts, and allowing her fingertips to touch his shoulder every evening before she went to bed, this was the first time he had ever seen the face of the woman he was supposed to marry. She had a small mole beneath the outer corner of her left eye. He took 3 steps toward the foot of the staircase. You're wearing gray today, he said. Priscilla didn't move. The blood drained slowly from her face, beginning at her forehead and moving downward, and the hand gripping the banister tightened until her fingertips turned pale. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. A gray coat, Raphael continued in that same ordinary voice. Buttons covered in matching fabric. You're wearing the pearl earrings your father gave you in April. You stood at the top of this staircase at 5:30 this afternoon, and you gave orders to those 2 men. He paused. I'm asking you for the 2nd time. Which car did they take? Priscilla retreated 1 step up the staircase. She was the daughter of Ambrose Marchetti. From childhood, she had been taught never to reveal fear, and in that moment, everything she had ever been taught was useless, because she was standing before a man she hadn't known was watching her, and she had no idea how long he had been doing it. You can see, she said. It wasn't a question. Raphael didn't answer. He turned away. At the far end of the corridor, Bruno Tessaro was already standing by the main door with the keys to the 2nd car in one hand, and on the screen of the phone in his other hand, a small point of light was moving slowly along the waterfront south of the city. It marked the car driven by Curtis Nolan, the Marchetti's head driver, whom Naomi had recognized by the HLM pin on his jacket. The tracking device beneath that car had been placed there 3 weeks earlier, and Bruno had been following its glowing point since 10 to 6. He didn't need to ask his employer a single question. He already knew where they had to go. Outside in the courtyard, 6 men were waiting beside 2 cars. Raphael walked past Priscilla Marchetti without looking at her again. They intercepted Nolan's car at an abandoned warehouse near the Quincy docks before the 2 men could take Naomi any further. Unaware that Raphael's vision had been restored, Nolan's men were caught entirely off guard. Within minutes, Bruno's men secured the site and brought Naomi safely back to the estate, keeping her under protected isolation until the final confrontation was ready. 4 days later, in a private dining room on the 7th floor of a club in Back Bay, 6 men sat around a long walnut table, and at the head of it stood a black speakerphone connected to Providence. Ambrose Marchetti, 68 years old, sat across from Raphael and presented his proposal for a joint governing council, controlling the entire waterfront from Chelsea to Quincy. With the confidence of a man who had counted every vote before entering the room, he spoke for 15 minutes. Near the end, he leaned toward the man beside him and said half-jokingly, loud enough for 2/3 of the table to hear, that Corvino couldn't see anything anyway, so there wasn't much point in discussing it with him. Raphael Corvino lifted his head. He removed his dark glasses, folded the arms, and placed them on the wood. "I can see you very clearly, Mr. Marchetti." No one in the room moved. Raphael opened the leather case at his feet and began placing items on the table one at a time, slowly, allowing several seconds between each one. A clear plastic specimen tube with a black cap, containing a dark metal fragment about 1/8 of an inch long, with one edge cut straight and the other beveled, removed from behind the iris of his left eye. A 27-page materials analysis report, opened to page 11, where a sequence of 7 characters had been read under 50 times magnification. A 31-page report from the investigation firm in Hartford, opened to page 19, its cover bearing the image of an anchor with 3 diagonal lines and 3 capital letters. 3 pages of test results from the Worcester laboratory. Bruno had quietly confronted Dr. Sloan at his private office earlier that morning, securing both the blue medical file and a recorded confession before the doctor could alert the Marchettis. A small audio recorder was then placed on the table, and Dr. Wendell Sloan's voice filled the room, naming dates, amounts of money, and the man who had paid him. And finally, Raphael placed the blue medical file on the table, open to the 3 pages bearing cancellation stamps, 3 orders for new scans issued across 5 years, with the same carefully slanted handwriting beneath every stamp. Raphael didn't say another word as he laid those things before them. Ambrose Marchetti didn't reach out to touch any of them. The speakerphone at the head of the table remained silent for exactly 14 seconds before the man in Florida spoke and said he was withdrawing from the proposal. Over the next 24 hours, the remaining 3 families withdrew from every open agreement with the Marchetti family. The bank suspended funding on 2 bridge loans, and within a week, the books of Harbor Line Marine Supply were placed under seal. The empire Ambrose Marchetti had spent 40 years building collapsed without another sound. The following morning, Priscilla Marchetti left the estate. She was pulling her suitcase through the main hallway when she encountered Naomi walking in the opposite direction. Priscilla stopped dead in her tracks, her hand freezing on the handle of her luggage. A flicker of shock crossed her face as she realized her plan had completely unraveled. The 2 women faced each other, and this time, Priscilla didn't begin at Naomi's shoes and work her way upward. She looked directly into Naomi's face, her voice tight. "What did you do?" she asked. "To make him trust you that much?" Naomi truly considered the question. She thought about it longer than Priscilla expected. "I told him what I saw," she said. "You never did." Priscilla didn't answer. She pulled her suitcase toward the door and never looked back. That afternoon, Attorney Ferrante was summoned to the estate to prepare the documents establishing a foundation in the name of Juliana Corvino, and the only provision Raphael dictated for him to record word for word was that the foundation would cover the full cost of eye surgery for those who couldn't afford to pay for it themselves. One afternoon in October, the debt of $61,000 bearing Naomi Fletcher's name was paid in full. The papers were signed, and from that day forward, she was free to go anywhere she wished. She still carried the tea tray out to the back porch at 4 o'clock, as she had done every afternoon for the past several weeks, set down the cup, turned the handle toward Raphael's right hand, then remained there, and opened her mouth to tell him what the tide looked like that day. Raphael raised a hand to stop her. "Today, let me." He sat upright and looked out across the water. "The tide is coming in. The water has covered the entire stretch of mud now, and only one outcrop of rock remains above it on the left. The water is the color of tin today, brighter than it was yesterday. There are 4 boats. The one farthest to the left is painted red, and a patch of paint the size of a hand has peeled away from its bow. There is only one layer of clouds, moving very slowly, and the sun is sinking low, so the shadow of this railing stretches all the way to the final step." Naomi stood perfectly still, both hands still holding the tray. "Miss Fletcher, I want you to stay." He turned toward her. "Not to carry tea." A foundation has just been established in my sister's name, and it needs someone who understands this work through the whole of her life, not through a diploma. Naomi didn't answer at once. She set down the tray, reached into the coat pocket where she kept her small belongings, and took out the penlight. Then she placed it on the small table between them, as though returning something that had finished the work it was meant to do. Raphael picked up the light and pushed it back toward her. Then he rose, walked down the steps into the garden, and didn't count his footsteps anymore. For 5 years, 16 people in that house had shielded Raphael Corvino from the world, and in doing so, they had taken the world away from him. Only one person had dared to look directly into his eyes and tell him the truth about what she saw, and that was worth more than all the others combined. True power doesn't lie in making other people bow their heads. It lies in having someone who dares to raise her own and tell you the truth. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and share this video so you can continue hearing more meaningful stories every day. How did Naomi and Raphael's story make you feel? Have you ever met someone who dared to tell you the truth at the moment you needed it most? Please leave a few words in the comments. We would truly love to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.